The Industrial Revolution was important. The climate revolution would be even more important. And we've got to finish the transition to renewables. We can accelerate the closure of coal-fired power stations. We can move more decisively to renewable-based energy. Regenerative agriculture is an area we can lead the world. Given the land we've got and the quality of that land and the capacity to improve the carbon content of that soil, we can actually lead the world. And the agricultural sector can be net negative emissions. Today we're talking a fair bit about structural change and the necessity of repositioning our country moving forward, taking perhaps a 2 or 3 decade view of where we are and what we should be. In those terms, I think one of the most significant challenges is to give proper recognition to our first Australians, not just in the Constitution and by way of a voice, but deal directly with the issue of disadvantage. I mean, it's realistically nearly 250 years since we actually have been confronted with this issue, and nothing's been done about it in that time. So I think that is a major challenge. Whoever's in government, it should be given a priority. It keeps getting pushed off for one reason or another. And I think it's a national embarrassment that we haven't come to some sort of treaty arrangement where most of the other world countries that have had an Indigenous heritage issue have actually addressed it. So I think that's an important challenge. But today we're talking about another challenge, which is climate, a source of constant frustration to me, I must say, because I have been at this issue since the late 80s. I look back fondly at the period of the late 80s, early 90s, when we had pretty much unanimous support in the coalition for a decisive and government-led response to climate. We were talking then as a policy of a 20% cut in emissions by the year 2000 off a 1990 base. And there was no opposition from the then government either, whether it was Hawke or Keating. It was a unique opportunity to actually start the process. And if we'd been able to achieve that sort of reduction in each of the 3 decades since then, we'd be at less than half our Paris level commitments already. So, we would have made an enormous amount of progress. It would have created billions and billions of dollars of investment and growth and hundreds of thousands of jobs. And that's the cost of that inactivity over that period. There's only been a couple of short periods since then where there was more or less bipartisan support, particularly 2007 when Howard looked like he would lose. He agreed to an emissions trading scheme, and I thought between them and Rudd it would have happened. It didn't happen, of course. We had a period of pricing carbon under Gillard, but there's been a pretty very short-term focused slanging match between both sides of politics in the last couple of decades, scoring points on each other, shifting blame and making no progress. And today where we sit is that we're no better off really than any of that period. It's been a race to the bottom in recent days even, where both sides have backed off the significance of climate as an issue. Neither side is prepared to actually make a decisive stand. We are locked into Paris commitments that are quite unrealistic, given the commitment that we look like we're heading towards. The world is certainly heading towards net zero by 2050. I think Morrison will begrudgingly, in the run-up to COP26, commit to net zero by 2050. But that is meaningless if you stay with 26 to 28% reduction by 2030. You've got to front-end loaded. It needs to be more than 60% by 2030 to get to net zero by 2050. And we've got this fictional game being played by the Prime Minister, looking like he's being reluctantly dragged to that broad commitment, which most industrial countries are going to have made. In fact, a very high percentage of countries have already made, as have large numbers of the business community, various sub-government levels, cities, a lot of civil society organisations and business organisations and so on. But we are seeing a deliberate attempt to suppress interest in the issue of climate in this country. Neither side is prepared to take what they see as a political risk. And I find that the most bizarre assessment of the politics of that issue that I've seen. I mean, if you look at the momentum that has been built in this country for government-led change, over the last several decades. I mean, 70–80% of people in every poll want that sort of response. They certainly believe in renewables. They want to see a transition to electric vehicles and so on. I mean, these are issues that show up time and time again in the polls. It's the one poll they don't seem to want to pay any attention to. Tom mentioned the Wentworth by-election. I took a stand at the start of the Wentworth by-election, made a statement in the ABC that if a strong independent candidate stood in Wentworth, which was my old seat, and ran on essentially on the issue of climate, they'd win. And everyone from Anthony Green down laughed at me and said that's inconceivable. It's a 17.5% swing. That's the margin you'd have to achieve. Karen Phelps did stand. She did run pretty much on climate and focused on that and didn't get dragged off into a whole lot of extraneous issues as they threw a considerable amount of mud at her. When she won, they said, oh, well, she only won by 1,800 votes. But that was 1,800 votes on top of 17.5% swing. In historical terms, that was a massive swing. Even though Sharma was inevitably going to win that seat back, he's still sitting on a near 17% swing against where Malcolm held that seat in his time as his last term as Prime Minister. So, I mean, there are clear political messages here that are being ignored, and I find it incredible. Yet internationally, there's enormous momentum for change. I mean, the shift from Trump to Biden should not be underestimated in terms of its significance. And making John Kerry the climate envoy has been particularly important element of that. I mean, Kerry's held all the major positions in the US political system, as a leading senator, as a presidential candidate, as a Secretary of State. But he wants to define his career in terms of what he achieves with climate. He was instrumental in the Paris Agreement, and he wants to see now the world move decisively towards a sensible outcome on climate. And he's pushing very hard, and he and Biden in the virtual summit, for example, have done a very good job, 40 world leaders. And embarrassingly, our leader got up in front of that group and said some of the most ridiculous things I think I've heard anyone say, arrogantly saying how much we are leading, how strong we are, how much we've done, what we're achieving. I remember saying to Biden, you guys have got Silicon Valley, we're going to have Hydrogen Valley. Well, the horse laugh was worldwide on those sort of statements. And that just shows how out of touch they are, how much they want to suppress the issue of climate as an election issue. So I think the one message today is that climate should be made the election issue. And I think there's a lot of movement in a lot of seats. A lot of independents are looking at running in a number of key seats, either under the banner of the Voices and a number of other groups that have formed. We've got something like 40 or 50 seats already that are being contemplated for significant independents to run. They'll essentially run on issues like climate. And I think the opportunity is to make this election an election issue. Climate should see the election issue. What frustrates me is not only does Morrison not recognise the polls, and he doesn't recognise the global momentum, but he doesn't pay attention to particular events which add some substance to that. I mean, he doesn't pay any attention to market forces. And the markets have moved very fast on this issue in terms of attempts to price carbon, in terms of carbon trading systems, in terms of pointing out the transition benefits and costs. And this is very important. The costs of inaction are becoming enormous. And recently we've seen some estimates of the costs of bushfires, for example. The last Black Summer bushfires were something like 14 times the cost of the Black Saturday bushfires at well over $100 billion. And we're looking, there's some work being done by the University of Melbourne and ANU, suggesting that if we don't act decisively on climate, we will start to see an annual cost that mirrors the economic impact of the pandemic. Every year we'll have a pandemic-type recession if we don't deal with climate effectively. These are alarming numbers, very significant numbers, and well-based numbers in terms of economic and social research. Not only that, but there have been a lot of changes that have happened. In recent days, we've seen Shell forced by the government to increase its emissions reduction commitments to over 60%. We've seen Chevron lose a vote at its AGM, getting 3 members of 3 climate activists appointed to its board. We've seen the International Energy Agency come out with a very, very strong statement about how we should end our links with fossil fuels. And this is very significant because the International Energy Agency was set up as a voice, as a front piece, a mouthpiece, if you like, for the fossil fuel sector, beginning back at the time of the OPEC price rises and so on. And here they've ditched their membership, in a sense, to make this stand. It's a very significant stand, and they draw attention to possible pathways between now and to get to net zero by 2050. They're realistic. I think really is a jolt to the fossil fuel sector. The private sector, of course, is also moving. The banks won't finance a lot of fossil fuel projects anymore. The insurers won't insure them. Yet all those market forces are being ignored by a government that prides itself on its reliance on market forces wherever possible. In recent days, we've seen some really quite silly decisions by this government. Pitt blocking a wind farm in Queensland, stopping the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility from funding a wind farm to keep the money for a coal-fired power station. There is no net demand for coal-fired power stations in North Queensland. I've spoken to the power authorities. They laugh at the suggestion. Not only that, but the private sector, the banks, some 85 international banks won't finance it. None of our 4 big banks will finance it. The big insurers won't insure it. And by the way, solar and wind are far cheaper. You can build the plants quicker and you can get far cheaper power and with effective storage, way cheaper than you can consider even the most supercritical coal-fired power stations. So this is just a nonsense that they're running for political reasons, not based in any fact, not based in terms of any market reality. We've also had Taylor changing the rules about ARENA. The government announced recently, of course, a large support for 2 large gas projects, the one particularly in the Hunter Valley, 660 megawatts, when their own regulators tell them that the net impact of Liddell closing in 2023 will be 154 megawatts. They're committed to 600 megawatts at an incredible, and even more incredible, they've got Snowy Hydro, giving Snowy Hydro the right to build that $600 million project. It'll be a stranded asset within a decade. It'll be used 2% of the time as a peaker. This is just to make the point that he says, well, we need a transition fuel. We don't need a transition fuel. 30 years ago, we started the argument we need a transition, should think about a transition from coal-fired power to gas and get a 40 to 60% reduction in emissions, depending on whether it's black or brown coal. But that was when solar and wind were very expensive. They're now very cheap. And so there's no need for transition. You can go all the way and go to net zero emissions at a much cost-effective process. And so you're seeing these decisions being taken by government, changing ARENA now to actually, although its mandate in law is to focus on renewables, he's going to change that by regulation to broaden that to include gas. Now, this is an insult to anybody who's put decades of work into the renewable sector to start with. And that's what they've got to do to get any level of support for a gas project, because the market certainly is not going to build it. It'll only get built if the government uses taxpayers' money to build it. That's, as I say, a stranded asset within a decade. And so these sort of changes that they're making are not, they're not listening to anybody in that advice, apart from a few mates in the gas industry, part of the COVID recovery team, and he's paying off to them by those sort of decisions. It's not in the national interest. And the last big thing that's happened in recent days is, of course, that the court in Australia, federal court, has found that the government has a duty of care when it comes to these sorts of decisions. Let me tell you, I imagine there will be many, many cases globally taken out against governments on the basis of duty of care for the long-term damage they're going to do to the next generations by not responding decisively now. Again, they fob that off and pay no attention to it. And the mainstream media, of course, play down these decisions as if they don't really matter. But collectively, you've now had a string of these decisions domestically and internationally that added to the momentum of Biden and the momentum of John Kerry's push. Johnson's going to drive COP26 in a very decisive way. The G7, the G20, the G7 has come out in favour of stopping fossil fuel projects, limiting or eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. We are really a laggard, and we are a long way back, and they don't want to look at that. I mean, I've looked at a couple of recent surveys of our position. We ranked the lowest out of 57 countries surveyed in the 2020 Climate Change Performance Index, and we ranked out of 177 countries, we ranked 176 in the 2020 UN Sustainable Development Report. Now, the evidence is overwhelming that we are way off the mark, and the costs of inaction are mounting. Looking down the possibility of, I think, as this ANU Melbourne research suggests, of a COVID-style recession annually as a result of not the impact, the economic and social impact, the disruption effects, if we don't actually move, and that's within a very short period of time. We haven't got a lot of time to start the process to get it done. Yet on the positive side, I mean, there are very real opportunities. I guess the other thing I should say is that although the world is moving, even the world hasn't faced the reality of the climate challenge. No, there isn't a government in the world or a government or policy authority in the world that has accepted the reality of the magnitude and urgency of the change and the financing of that change. And as Kerry's been pointing out, even if the 195 countries who signed up to Paris actually achieved those emissions reductions, there's still some considerable doubt about some of them, but that would still leave us with 3.7 degree Celsius warming. And so the reality has not sunk in yet globally, but in yet context, we're a laggard even further behind most of those other major players. And although there will be a lot more momentum between now and COP26, G7, G20, COP26, Morrison's just doing what he can to suppress it as an issue here. The mainstream media are helping him out flat out on this. And I think that's grossly irresponsible. I've been saying I think it's reckless. On the other side, if we were to move decisively and put in place sensible policies in the key sectors, we would accelerate the development of this country in a way that people would have never imagined. The Industrial Revolution was important. The climate revolution would be even more important. And we can look at the sector by sector. In the energy sector, of course, we've got to finish the transition to renewables. We can accelerate the closure of coal-fired power stations. We can move more decisively to renewable-based energy. With hydrogen, in time, not now, in time, maybe, with ammonia, with enormous export potential of the power and of ammonia and of hydrogen. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to have to be part of a concerted 20 to 30 year strategy. It's got to be implemented with bipartisan support over time. In the transport sector, I mean, we get these ridiculous statements, as we saw by Taylor recently, that hybrids are cheaper and they bring lower emissions. Well, I thought a hybrid had two engines, not one. I thought it was more expensive and heavier. It's a step in the right direction, don't get me wrong, but why would you go part way like, the transition fuel? Why not go all the way to full electrification of the vehicle fleet? And ultimately, some of that could be hydrogen fuel cells, but we're a long way from that being commercially viable. There's no doubt that that's going to happen, and it's going to happen faster than they imagine. And as soon as the big car companies produce an affordable electric vehicle, just about everyone's going to want one. And we're very close to that happening. You see the commitments that were made in response to Biden's statement talking about his objectives in terms of petrol-driven vehicles by the 2030s. Ford and Holden immediately made big commitments. And now you've got Volvo committing to most of their fleet being electric by 2025, and a lot of others now. As soon as you get those cheaper cars, I mean, Musk said this weekend he's going to produce these, Model Y, that is going to be affordable, and that'll take the market. And the market believes him because the value of the Tesla share price is higher than some of the next 6 major car companies. And, he only, at this stage, by comparison, delivers a small number of cars. Regenerative agriculture is an area we can lead the world. Given the land we've got and the quality of that land and the capacity to improve the carbon content of that soil, we can actually lead the world. And the agricultural sector can be net negative emissions and reasonably quickly. And some elements of the agricultural sector already seen that. The National Farmers Federation is committed to net zero 2050. But you've seen a whole host of other commitments. I mean, the Grains Council is talking net negative because they know they get 3 for 1. Every 1 of carbon they put in, they can get 3 back by improving the quality of the soil. And it gives the farmers another income. It generates carbon credits, which the farmers can sell. So instead of having to put their hand out in a drought or a fire or a flood, they'd actually have another income stream by simply improving the carbon content of the soils. And the technology for that is now there. Satellite technology to measure the carbon content of soils for a few dollars, and they're aiming at a few cents per hectare, is a game changer, and it's Australian technology. So we're on the verge of being able to lead the world in regenerative agriculture. Then we go to building codes and building materials. Again, we've got enormous potential. We've got all the possibilities of green cement and green steel and so on, all of which is within our purview, all of which is achievable in this country. And we're one of the few countries in the world that's got the key elements, the key minerals, if you like, lithium and graphite, cobalt, sun, wind, all the resources you're going to need to do it. We have an enviable endowment of those to give us our own industries. We could have a battery industry in this country. We could have not only export graphite, for example, and lithium, but we could have a lithium-ion battery industry in the country at the drop of a hat. These are all realistic possibilities. And of course, around that are all the services that will come. So I think that it's just staggering that in the terms of today, both sides of Parliament are spending their time trying to suppress climate as an issue. It's a race to the bottom to see who can do less. And that's where I think is a unique opportunity for organisations like yours and a number of others to actually come to this and say, look, let's make it an election issue. And I thought you're starting to see this movement now, as I said, in terms of an independence movement. It's quite possible that independents could hold the balance of power in both houses relatively easily at the next election. And although they don't, I wouldn't support them forming a party or anything. That's too hard and costs too much money and that's too unreliable. But under a loose alliance on issues like climate and integrity in government and accountability in government and so on, they could actually say to whoever's in power, you put up a sensible piece of legislation in the direction of the priorities that we've got, and we'll support it. Otherwise, we will not. Don't waste your time. And they could really drive government in this country better than either the 2 major parties are going to do. I think it's a tragedy that we've come to the position where, I'm embarrassed. So all the work that people have put into this issue over the last several decades to see both sides of politics now running scared on climate when the electorate itself is crying out for them to do it. And I think if I had my way, I'd put the word Wentworth on Morrison's pillow and let him sleep on it every night, because that was a definitive example of what can be done and will be done again at the next election. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. You have a wealth of information and understandings of what's going on, and really, really important. And I get that you don't hold much hope for the current situation prior to the next election, and hopefully you see some hope after the election. But in the meantime,
I'd like to say one thing. I think the election will be before COP26.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's a prediction. But I do think they won't want to take the risk. They'll try and get it out of the way. They're not running well on the rollout of the vaccine. They're not running well on quarantine. The economy's numbers are starting to fade. I mean, I was asked to say something about the budget, but the budget actually, they say it secures recovery, but it doesn't sustain recovery. It gets them through the next election where the numbers will be okay. Even though you see the growth rates have dropped from over 3 to now 1.8, and it'll go lower now consistently quarter by quarter going forward. The employment numbers have been good, but they won't be sustained in the environment that we've got. We've got some massive problems now with skill shortages, no immigration, no itinerant workers and visa workers and so on. You know, these are very big calls on the government. The biggest assumption in the budget was, of course, that the virus will behave, and of course it won't.
So, John, you've done a really good. John, you've done a really good job laying out the problems, but you probably know that we're a solution-focused organisation and that we're also non-partisan. So I'd be interested to hear from you just your thoughts about how can we, as a grassroots non-partisan organisation, influence the situation, and also what are your thoughts about the best pathway to creating the political will for a carbon price?
Well, I mean, the carbon price has become a very, very difficult, poisonous, wicked problem in Australian politics, unfortunately. And that really annoys me, because if you were a genuine conservative government, one who believes in small government, believes in low levels of regulation, believes in relying on market forces when you can, you put a price on carbon, wouldn't hesitate. Because it's simply you're making the polluters pay. And why wouldn't you do that? And if you'd done that back 30 years ago, we'd have a much lower price on carbon. Treasury's done a study that shows that. The implicit carbon price will be much, much lower. And as longer you leave it, the harder it becomes. But inevitably, there will be a price put on carbon. Some of the things the government does, of course, puts a price on carbon. It's an artificially low price. They control these sort of emissions, what do they call this thing now? Emissions Reduction Fund. I'm not sure what name it's got these days. A figment of Abbott's imagination originally. They've got a limited amount of money. They buy a few carbon credits, buy a few carbon reductions, I should say, but that's not putting a full-scale price on carbon. And what annoys me is a lot of the companies I work with today, a lot of the institutions have put a price on carbon for their own activities, and seeking to restructure what they do. The investment community is having a big impact. I've spent 10 or 12 years trying to drive the investment community to recognise climate risks. The essence of that is a superannuation fund had to look at its climate exposures, investments at which it was climate exposed, implicitly put a price on those exposures from their point of view. Everyone's doing it, but the government it's just such a poisonous issue that the government's just reluctant to address it. But as an economist, you know, that's where you start. That's not where you finish. You know, that's the first thing you do. It's not the only thing you do, but it's certainly the first thing you do. And Garno told them that, and Rudd was going to do it in the emissions trading scheme. And unfortunately, the Greens knew to that. And then, you know, we've had this terrible experience within both parties against anyone taking a stand on carbon pricing.
Yes, we're very aware of the problems. We're very aware of the problems, but one of the questions in our chat mentions that we regard a legislated target for net zero by 2050 as a good stepping stone towards getting a carbon price later, and we're keen to influence the modern liberals, for instance, Jason Falinski, to follow that line. And we understand that Jason worked for you at one point. And so, what insights do you have about how we can reach the people such as the modern liberals and other centrists in the parliament?
Well, I mean, they don't speak up on both sides. Yes. And if you could, there has been an attempt to have a Friends of, you know, Climate sort of group within the parliament, and it's had some sort of rudimentary interest, but there's a lot of pressure on them not to speak up, not to be disruptive. That seem to be at odds with the main position of the front line of the party. You see what's happened in the Labor Party with Fitzgibbons taking a position in support of fossil fuels, and so they backed off everything else. You know, this is just a ridiculous response. The same thing's happening in the government. The National Party's having an unusual sway on coal. I mean, look, if you really, without wanting to be quoted on this, but if you add the number of people in the coal sector, and being generous, you're going to get about 30 or 40,000. The system would allow you to pay them all to stay home,
Yes.
rather than, but what we're talking about is transitioning them, giving them a pathway over the next couple of decades to move away from a coal-based industry, education, retraining, relocation, community support, and so on. And if you had a carbon price, the money's there for all of that if you want to do it. But they don't want to address it. And the problem with the carbon price debate has been one-sided. It's just looked at the impact of a price, which is, okay, if you want to look at putting a price on that form of pollution, why have we been inconsistent? If I put asbestos on your lawn, I'll get arrested, probably fined, maybe go to jail. If I pollute a river, I will. But it's okay to pump coal-fired power stations, to pump or gas-fired power stations to pump CO2 into the atmosphere, or for us to breathe the particulate emissions from dirty petrol. The second most dirty petrol in the OECD. Particulate emissions from vehicles kill more people, multiples of the road toll every year in this country. That should be a front page story every day. And it's not, because the industry suppressed. In fact, the government's just giving a couple of the remaining 2 refineries a couple of $1 billion to stay open. I hope that they shift in time to link that to at least cleaning up the fuel. There's got to be a plus in these things, not just putting money out the door. In the midst of COVID, there was $2 billion for 4 refineries. We've now only got 2 because 2 went anyway, and they're foreign owned. The money goes offshore. Nothing's done to preserve the situation. It doesn't improve fuel security. All the arguments they run. So it's frustration, but a carbon price gives you the mechanism by which you can compensate where you want to, direct money where you want to, whether it's to individuals or households or, here's a bloke who lost an election, they say, over the GST, talking about compensation for the GST.
Yes.
It's exactly the same sort of issue of applying a compensation model. And I know you guys look at the dividend model, but there are many ways. I mean, you can decide if you have the most important thing is to have a pure market price on carbon, a proper independent market price run by a Reserve Bank type institution, open and transparent tenders. You get a price, you collect the revenue, okay, then you decide what you do with that revenue and how you allocate that revenue. And I think this was such an attractive idea that got polluted by short-term political point scoring.